Today I'm going to walk through the process of printing a paper Drypoint engraving that I've made on a piece of mat board. This is the finished plate, all set for printing, but I'm going to go ahead and show you the process, how I got here. First you want to seal the mat board or the chipboard, whatever your substrate is, if it's not plastic. You want to use gloss medium, never ever matte medium. Your paper will stick to the plate. For this plate I used some Lasco hard resist that I had sitting around. I don't really use it for etching, and it seemed to work pretty well. It's very thin, dries incredibly quickly, and goes on thin enough it doesn't mess with the lines. I used a variety of tools including roulettes, other engraving tools, but my primary one was a twisted scribe etching needle. I just used a basic twisted scribe, and you can purchase these various places online. This one is an EC Lions model, and rather than making a burr like you would have in plastic or in metal, all it really does is push the paper down and creates engraved lines for the ink to sit in. So it's more like an engraving process. And the one thing you want to do after doing this is probably seal your lines just a little bit, because the paper might be exposed. Speaking of paper, the kind you're going to want to use for this is going to be a cotton printmaking paper. I don't really tend to use the sulfite based papers. I prefer Stonehenges or Lennox. Sometimes I'll use Reeves BFK. That one you have to soak a little longer, so I don't really use it as often. You'll also want to have what's called a registration system, and that's just a way of setting up the press and the plate so that the paper will sit in the center of your sheet of paper once you're printing it, especially if you're going to do multiple colors. The empty space here represents where your matrix would sit, and this was your margin area. I tend to go for about 40 millimeters. Often I do a little bit more if I have the extra paper. Today, however, I'm using my grid system on my press, and this is just a series of half-inch marks, basically in red, and 1-inch marks in black. And I'll just use this line here. This is about 40 millimeters over. And I'll put a piece of blue tape up in the corner, usually, to keep it in line, so it lines up real nice along this red line. Black line is where the edge of the paper will sit. It's going to go all the way down here, and this is where the corner of your paper will be. The inks I'm using today are Caligo Safe Wash inks, and I'm mixing black with a little bit of blue. It'll give me a second color almost on the plate tone, if there is any. It's a really easy to use ink. It's just like oil-based. It cleans up better and it's not as toxic. I tend to use cheesecloth for the wiping process after the ink is on the plate, and it's just the difference between two kinds you can get. This one's tighter weave, this one's got more of an open mesh, and I haven't really seen much of a difference between them. You also want to have a different piece of cheesecloth for each color, ideally. Mine, I tend to use this one, for instance, for green and blue, and then I'd have a separate one for pinks and yellows, lighter colors. And you can see this is the cheesecloth with the more open mesh. It doesn't hold up as good when the plate has a lot of texture, so that would be one major difference between the two qualities. The overall objective is to get the ink into your lines that you make on your mat board matrix, and you do that by putting ink over the whole surface of the plate, and you use mat board cards or whatever you have available, something that's not going to scratch it. Push the ink down in there. The cheesecloth will also push the ink down in there, and you don't want to pull it out once it's in there. At this point I'm not going to bore you with watching me put ink all over this plate, rubbing it with cheesecloth, pushing the ink around.
Okay, alright, fine. In the interest of solidarity, I'll show some of the suffering, okay? So you get your mat board scrap or a little cardboard square. Something plastic would work too. You get this guy, you want to warm the oil-based ink up a little bit. This is washable ink, but it still has oil in it, and you still want to get it loosened up before you start scraping it onto the plate. At this point, I would put some medium in there, like some Miracle Wipe or some oil or linseed oil or something. Make it just a little bit thinner to make it easier to wipe. So it's a balancing act between too loose and too thick ink for intaglio. So you don't want it to be taken out. Okay, that looks good. And the object here is to cover the whole plate, even places you might not be wanting the image to stick on the paper. Because there's places, especially on a collograph plate like this, that's got the engraved lines, there's places that might be picked up that are interesting. Plus I have this roulette work on here. I definitely want to get that filled with the ink. So you're basically going to cover the whole thing, whole plate, push it into the lines. When you go to wipe with the tarlatan or the cheesecloth, this is going to push it into your lines even more. So what I like to do is get it started like this, and then flip the card around and start scraping some of it with a clean edge. Mike picks it up a little more, get it all over whole plate. And you definitely don't want it to be too cold when you're doing this. You want to have a nice warm area. If you have one available, you could use a hot plate. But with these oil-based or washable inks, generally you don't have to do that, especially if you use some kind of additive that loosens the ink up a little. So that's what I'm looking for, total coverage. Basically, you wouldn't be able to see the image at this point. And what I would do is I'd get another card and start scraping that ink off. You can see we want to take some off the top. If you're frugal, you'll go ahead and put that back in there. But you really want to start with as minimal amount of ink on here as you can. So it's kind of a process of learning how much ink to put on the plate initially before you actually get this down. So there you go. Cover the whole thing with ink, and then you go to the cheesecloth, which we are going to show now.
I'm just going to show you how to use the cheesecloth once you do have your plate covered in ink. So you have yourself a nice clean piece here. You're going to want to start with more like a used piece. Let's pretend you're doing this for the first time though. You want to have a nice flat surface, and you're going to ball it up. You're going to push most of the excess to the back like this with your fingers, and you want to make kind of a handle back here that you can grip. Push it against your hand, and then push it against a hard surface like the table. And you want this as flat as possible so it doesn't pull the ink out once you're beginning the wiping process. The objective is to get some of the excess ink off, but also to push it into the lines, not to extract the ink. You're going to kind of move it around in a circle, sort of. And with a plate like this, it's very easy to over wipe it, so you want to stop before you get to that point. You can kind of see the ink in the lines. I'm going to clean all the edges of the plate as well, so you don't have any ink exploding out when you're printing. The next step is to polish the surface of the plate with a nice flat piece of paper. I use phone book pages, sometimes I use tracing paper, and this will get rid of the plate tone. You're just going to skim the surface of the plate with the paper, keeping your fingers very flat, and you can easily over wipe on this process too, so you want to be very careful. And we're just removing the ink that's in the margins where the lines are absent. I've already cut my paper the right size. You can probably see me doing that in another video where I'm prepping paper. At this point I'm just going to put the paper in the water. This is a photo tray I use. Anything that's deep enough to hold about an inch of water will do. The paper will sit in here for about 10 minutes or so. Once it's out, I'm gonna squeegee the surface. And what I do is I use a piece of plexiglass to stick the paper to once it's wet, and I want to get all the surface water off. Then you put it between a couple pieces of blotter paper, or you can use cotton towels if you have those available as well. And basically what you want to do is get all the sheen off the paper. You don't want it to be glistening. And the pressure on my press is already set. I'll probably have a video on that later as well. These are the blankets I'm using for this press. I have a pusher, which is this thin one, and the cushion, which is this thick gray one, that helps push the paper, the cotton paper, once it's wet, down into the lines of my plate. And I usually cover that with a piece of newsprint rather than a felt blanket or a sizing catcher. And you can see this is how the pressure is set. Plate is registered on the press with my lines that I had marked out before. And just double check it, make sure it's perfectly straight and where I need it to be so the margins come out nice. This is the tricky part. You're going to want to take a piece of paper, I'm going to line one corner up. This is basically how I do it. And then I line the edge closest to me along the black line. You just kind of roll it down onto the plate and usually push it down a little bit just to make sure there's no air underneath there. Next, the newsprint goes on top of that. And then with the blankets, you want to roll those down too so you don't move things. And then this is a kind of a gear-driven press, so it's kind of rough to print with. And you just want to keep going. You don't want to stop. So keep rolling, and reverse the process. Gonna gently roll back the blankets, and then the newsprint. Usually your water and your paper will make it stick to your newsprint. So you just kind of hold the print down, pull that back. You can see right away that there's some black ink. That means there's enough pressure, maybe a little too much. And pull this off very carefully. Right now the ink would want to be on everything in your studio. I'm going to check the print over, make sure all the lines are clear, everything printed well, there's no ink in the margins, and that the pressure of the press was set correctly. You can usually tell by the embossment. From here I'll take the print and I put it between these two pieces of melamine that I have. And the print would be wet at this point. I'm going to put a couple of pieces of newsprint in between each one. And then compress this for about 24 hours or so. Just give it enough time so it doesn't become wrinkled. Thought I'd go ahead and show you one of my proofs. And I took this proof off of an old print that I didn't really care anything about. You can see one of the first ones, I had a little dent there, had a piece of tape on the press or something. And you can see this is over wiped, and this is what it would look like if you spend too much time with the tarlatan or the cheesecloth or the phone book pages. If you wipe too much, you're going to get the ink out of your lines, and it's not going to be quite as good. You can see this real expressive swath through there. Really didn't have any ink in it, so that one did not make it into the edition. This one, however, did. And I believe this is number 4 of 7. This is just how I sign these. This print's called Petition to an Empty Heaven. And usually you want to put the title in the lower left, number in the middle, signature on the right, under the print. I'm planning to give one of these prints to a subscriber, and I'll draw that name randomly sometime in the next couple weeks. Thanks for watching. Be sure to look out for new videos coming in the future. I'll talk about tools or other processes, and if there's something in particular you want to see, just leave a comment below.